American pilots watched a bomb fall, and then it ignited rockets. It hit 600 miles per hour. It had no landing gear. And inside, a human pilot. This wasn't a plane, it was a manned missile. This is the story of the Baka bomb. March 21st, 1945, 18,000 feet above the Philippine Sea, roughly 300 miles southeast of Kyushu. The air inside the cockpit of the F-6F Hellcat smelled of ozone, avgas, and sweat. Lieutenant Commander Jim Thach checked his altimeter, the needle trembling just past the 18,000-foot mark. Below him, the Pacific was a sprawling, indifferent sheet of azure, broken only by the whitecaps whipped up by the wind. But Thach wasn't looking at the water. His eyes were scanning the horizon, squinting against the harsh glare of the tropical sun, searching for the radar ghosts that the Combat Information Center on the USS Hornet had been screaming about for the last 10 minutes. Vector 310, Angels 18, bogies closing fast, many bogies. The radio crackled with the frantic, clipped static of the flight controller. Thach adjusted his grip on the stick, the leather of his gloves creaking. Roger, Hornet. Tally-ho. I see 'em. Ahead, hanging in the sky like dark smudge marks against the clouds, was a formation of Japanese bombers. They were Mitsubishi G-4M Betties, the cigar-shaped twin-engine workhorses of the Imperial Japanese Navy. They were notorious fire traps, nicknamed Type 1 lighters, by American pilots because a few well-placed, 50-caliber rounds into their wing tanks usually turned them into falling torches. But something was wrong. Thach signaled his wingman to tighten up the formation. As the Hellcats roared closer, closing the distance at nearly 300 knots, the silhouette of the Japanese formation became clearer. The Betties were flying sluggishly. They were laboring, their engines churning black smoke as they struggled to maintain altitude. They looked heavy. Check those bellies, Thach muttered to himself, flipping the safety cover off his gun trigger. Usually, a Betty on a maritime strike carried a single, long Type 91 torpedo tucked under its fuselage. From a distance, that's what this looked like. A dark, cylindrical shape slung beneath the mother plane, but as the range dropped to a mile, the details sharpened. It wasn't a torpedo. It was too thick. And it had wings. Blue leader to flight? Thach's voice was calm, belying the knot of confusion tightening in his gut. Targets have strange external stores. Looks like a parasite aircraft. Watch for drops. The parasite was small, stubby, and looked like a toy airplane glued to the belly of the bomber. It had a glass canopy, tiny, squared-off wings, and a twin-rudder tail. It looked innocuous, almost ridiculous, dwarfed by the massive bomber carrying it. But the Japanese wouldn't be hauling gliders into a combat zone protected by Task Force 58's Combat Air Patrol unless they had a very specific, very nasty purpose. The Japanese formation commander, Lieutenant Commander Goro Nonaka, leading the God Thunder Corps, likely saw the swarms of Hellcats descending like hawks. The Betties began to bank, a desperate, lumbering turn away from the interceptors. They were miles from the American fleet too far to drop conventional torpedoes. Take 'em out before they release. Thach yelled. Thach rolled his Hellcat inverted and pulled into a steep dive, lining up on the trailing bomber on the left flank. The G-force pressed him into his seat, his vision graying slightly at the edges. The roar of the Pratt & Whitney engine rose to a deafening scream. The Betty filled his gun sight. At 400 yards, Thach squeezed the trigger. 6 50-caliber machine guns in the wings erupted, the airframe shuddering with the recoil. Tracers lashed out, stitching a line of fire across the Betty's right wing and fuselage. Pieces of aluminum ripped away, flashing in the sun. Smoke began to trail from the starboard engine. But the Japanese pilot didn't jettison his cargo. He held on. Usually, a bomber under attack would drop its ordnance immediately to gain speed and maneuverability. These pilots were holding onto their burdens with a suicidal possessiveness. Thach pulled up, banking hard to avoid the debris field. He looked back over his shoulder. Another Hellcat from his squadron was hammering the lead bomber. The Betty's fuel tank caught, and a bloom of orange fire enveloped the wing. The bomber entered a death spiral, spinning down toward the ocean. As the bomber rolled over in its death throes, the clamps holding the strange object beneath it failed. The small, winged cylinder tumbled free. Thach watched, expecting the small craft to simply tumble into the sea like a dud bomb. It fell away from the burning mothership, nose dipping toward the Whitecaps 18,000 feet below. Then, the impossible happened. A plume of white smoke erupted from the tail of the falling object. It didn't just fall, it accelerated. A streak of fire shot out the back, and the small plane leveled out, correcting its tumble instantly. It wasn't a bomb falling to gravity, it was flying. And it was faster than anything Thach had ever seen. "Did you see that?" His wingman's voice cracked over the radio. "That thing just took off." The small aircraft, now trailing a thick wake of rocket exhaust, didn't try to dogfight. It didn't turn to engage the Hellcats. It simply put its nose down and dove, picking up speed at a rate that defied physics for a propeller plane. It was a missile, but it had a cockpit. Thach felt a chill that had nothing to do with the altitude. He realized, with a sudden, sickening clarity, what he was looking at. The Japanese weren't just dropping bombs anymore, they were flying them. The sky around the remaining bombers disintegrated into a chaotic swirl of aluminum shards, burning fuel, and tracer fire. The American Hellcats, possessing superior speed and altitude, were tearing through the formation like wolves through a flock of sheep. The Betties, weighed down by their parasitic cargo, were sitting ducks. They couldn't maneuver, they couldn't climb, they could only die. But amidst the massacre, another parasite dropped free from a burning bomber. "Fox 2! Another one loose!" a pilot shouted over the tactical frequency, his voice tight with adrenaline. This time, the release wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. The Japanese pilot, realizing he would never make it to the task force 50 miles away, had pulled the release handle. The clamps snapped open. The small, stubby aircraft fell away, momentarily hanging in the air like a stone. Lieutenant Junior Grade Spider Webb, flying off Thach's wing, banked hard to track the falling object. "I'm on him," Webb grit out. "I'm gonna splash him." Webb pushed his throttle past the detent, engaging the water injection system. His Hellcat surged, the engine howling as he dove after the small craft. He expected to catch it easily. A glider, no matter how aerodynamic, eventually loses energy. Webb lined up his sights, calculating the deflection for a slow-moving target. Then, the laws of aerial combat changed. From the rear of the falling craft, 3 distinct nozzles ignited in sequence. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. A blinding, violent tail of white smoke erupted from the object. It didn't ramp up speed like a propeller plane fighting for traction against the air. The acceleration was instantaneous. It was violent. The craft, designated the MXY-7 Ohka or Cherry Blossom by the Imperial Navy, kicked forward as if struck by a giant hammer. Inside that tiny cockpit, the Japanese pilot was being crushed back into his seat by G-forces that would have caused a standard pilot to black out. But this pilot didn't need to remain conscious for a landing. He didn't need to save fuel for a return trip. He only needed to keep his eyes open for the next few minutes. Webb's Hellcat was diving at nearly 400 miles per hour, the airframe rattling, the controls stiffening as he approached the sound barrier. But the Ohka was pulling away. It was embarrassing. The rocket-powered craft shrank rapidly in his windscreen, a silver dart racing toward the ocean. "He's leaving me standing still," Webb yelled, frustration bleeding into awe. "Speed is in excess of 500 knots. I repeat, target speed is over 500. The Ohka leveled out at wave-top height, skipping over the Whitecaps with terrifying stability. The smoke trail marked a straight, unwavering line toward the empty horizon. The range was too great. The Ohka had been released too early. It ran out of fuel miles short of the American fleet, splashing harmlessly into the sea in a fountain of white spray. But the damage was done. The concept had been proven. High above, the dogfight was winding down. The last of the Betties were spiraling into the ocean or exploding in mid-air. It was a complete tactical failure for the Japanese. Not a single ship had been hit. Yet, as Thach and his squadron reformed, circling the debris field of burning oil and floating wreckage, the mood was grim. There was no jubilant chatter usually associated with a turkey shoot. "Did you see the wings on that thing?" Thach asked, his voice crackling over the interplane frequency. They were plywood, short, stubby. "Yeah, and a bubble canopy," Webb replied, his breathing heavy. "I got a look at the cockpit before he lit the fuse. There was a guy in there, Jim. I swear to God. He looked right at me." The realization settled over the squadron like a shroud. They had heard rumors of the Kamikaze pilots crashing zeros and vowels into flight decks. That was terrifying enough, a desperate man weaponizing a standard machine. But this was different. This was a machine built solely to die. It had no landing gear. It had no machine guns. It was a 2,600-pound warhead with a human guidance system bolted to the back. Intelligence officers would later codify the weapon. They would learn it carried 3, Type 4, Mark I, Model 20 solid-fuel rockets. They would learn it hit speeds of 650 miles per hour in a divaster than any Allied aircraft could hope to intercept. They would give it a reporting name, a moniker that reflected the mixture of contempt and horror felt by the Western mind when confronted with such industrialized suicide. They wouldn't call it cherry blossom. They called it Baka, Japanese for idiot. "The Baka bomb," Thach whispered to himself, looking down at the oil slicks marking the graves of the Japanese airmen. "They're building flying coffins." The March 21st raid had been a failure, a massacre of the motherships before they could get within effective range. But Thach knew, as he turned his Hellcat back toward the Hornet, that the Japanese wouldn't make the same mistake twice. Next time, they would come closer. Next time, the rockets would ignite within sight of the fleet, and next time, the idiots wouldn't miss. Fast forward to April 12th, 1945. Radar Picket Station 14, 70 miles northwest of Okinawa. The destroyer, USS Mannert L Abele, was fighting a war all by herself. The sky above Picket Station 14 was a grey, swirling kaleidoscope of flak bursts and diving aircraft. Commander Alton Parker, the ship's captain, gripped the railing of the bridge, his knuckles white. The divine wind was blowing hard today. The Japanese had launched Kikusui no, 2 sending hundreds of suicide planes against the invasion fleet. And out here on the picket line, isolated and exposed, the destroyers were the first thing they saw. "Starboard side! Zeke! Diving!" A lookout screamed, his voice cracking over the general announcing system. The 40mm Bofors guns hammered a rhythmic, thumping bass line, while the 20mm Oerlikons chattered like manic typewriters. Tracers reached out, a desperate lattice of orange light trying to swat the fly out of the sky, but the Japanese pilot was determined. The Zero fighter, trailing smoke, slammed into the Abele's starboard side. The impact shuddered through the steel spine of the ship, throwing men to the deck. A fireball erupted, engulfing the midship guns. But the Abele was tough. Damage control parties were already sprinting into the smoke, hoses ready, shouting over the roar of the flames. She was hurt, slowing down, but she was still fighting. Her guns were still tracking. Then, the air changed. It wasn't the buzz of a radial engine. It wasn't the whine of a diving fighter. It was a rawara, hollow, tearing sound like the sky itself was being ripped open. "Low, bearing 130, on the deck." On the fantail, a gunner's mate strapped into his 20mm mount swung his weapon around. He was used to leading targets. You aimed ahead of the nose, sprayed a wall of lead, and let the plane fly into it. He looked for the silhouette of a Val dive bomber or a Kate torpedo plane. Instead, he saw a white blur. It was skimming the wave tops, kicking up a rooster tail of spray behind it. It had no propeller. Flames licked from 3 nozzles in its tail, pushing it forward with terrifying, unnatural velocity. It didn't bob or weave. It flew on a rail, locked onto the crippled destroyer. Too fast. The gunner screamed, jamming his shoulder into the harness, spinning the cranks as fast as he could. "I can't get a lead." The Bofors crews were having the same panic. Their optical sights were designed for aircraft moving at 300, maybe 350 miles per hour. This Baka, was closing at nearly 600 miles per hour. It was covering a mile every 6 seconds. The tracers fell behind it, splashing harmlessly into the wake of the rocket. The heavy 5-inch guns didn't even have time to train out. It was a mathematical impossibility for the human reflexes of the gun crews to catch up with the mechanical fury of the rocket. On the bridge, Commander Parker watched the white streak grow larger. There was no time to turn the ship, no time to maneuver. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. There is no defense against this. The Ohka pilot, Ensign Royal, locked inside his claustrophobic cockpit, lightly saw the grey steel of the Abele filling his entire world. He didn't flinch. The rocket fuel was spent, but the kinetic energy was enormous. At 14:46, the Ohka struck the USS Mannert L, Abele on the starboard side, right at the waterline, beneath the forward smokestack. This wasn't a plane crash. A plane crash crumpled metal and spread fire. This was a missile strike. The warhead, fused to detonate after penetrating the hull, punched through the destroyer's skin like a bullet through paper. A split second later, the warhead detonated inside the forward engine room. The explosion was cataclysmic. It didn't just damage the ship, it broke her back. A massive geyser of steam, oil, and steel shot hundreds of feet into the air. The keel of the destroyer snapped violently. The bow and the stern were heaved upwards, folding the ship in two like a broken toy. Men were thrown into the sea, stunned and deafened. As the survivors treaded water, choking on the thick, cloying fuel oil, they watched in horror. The Mannert L Abele, a 2,200-ton warship, didn't slowly capsize. She disintegrated. Within 3 minutes, she was gone, dragged under the waves by the weight of her broken machinery. The ocean went silent, save for the crackle of burning debris floating on the surface. The terrifying theory Jim Thach had witnessed in the sky weeks earlier had just become a bloody reality. The Japanese had successfully guided a manned missile through the most dense anti-aircraft screen in history, and they had snapped a US Navy destroyer in half with a single hit. The Baka was no longer a joke. It was a ship killer. Weeks later, on May 1st, 1945, in the hills overlooking Yontan Airfield, Okinawa, the rain didn't wash things clean. It just turned the red clay into a sucking, treacherous mud that coated everything. Sergeant Mike Kowalski wiped the grime from his flashlight lens and signaled his squad forward. "Cave mouth at 2 o'clock, he whispered. "Check your corners, flamethrower up." They were clearing the ridges, hunting for stragglers, snipers, and hidden artillery. The Japanese had dug into the coral and limestone of the island like termites, creating a subterranean network of tunnels that stretched for miles. The squad moved in, the air growing cool and damp as they stepped out of the humid jungle heat and into the earth. The beam of Kowalski's light cut through the gloom, dancing over crates of ammunition, piles of rotting rice, and bedrolls. Clear right, clear left. They moved deeper until the tunnel widened into a cavernous hangar carved by hand out of the living rock. Kowalski swung his light to the center of the chamber and stopped. "Whoa," a private breathed behind him. "What in the hell are those?" Lined up on wooden rails, looking like sleek white sharks sleeping in the dark, were 3 aircraft. But they were wrong. They were too small to be fighters, too smooth to be bombers. They sat low on the ground, resting on wooden skids instead of wheels. Kowalski approached the nearest one cautiously, his Thompson submachine gun raised. He ran a hand over the nose. It was cold, damp metal. He rapped his knuckles against the wings. Plywood. "It's those Baka bombs," Kowalski said, recognizing the silhouette from the intelligence briefings. The suicide rockets. Up close, the machine was terrifying not because of its complexity, but because of its simplicity. It was crude, industrialized death, stripped of any pretense of survival. Kowalski stepped up onto the wooden skid and peered into the cockpit. The canopy was open. He shined his light inside. It was a tomb, sized for a single man. There was no radio, no parachute, no ejection lever. The instrument panel was Spartan, an airspeed indicator, an altimeter, and a few switches for the rocket ignition. "Hey, Sarge," the private called out, pointing to the nose. "Look at this." The nose cone was unbolted on one of the adjacent craft, revealing the warhead. It wasn't just a bomb strapped to a plane. The plane was built around the explosive, 2,600 pounds of trinitromanol, enough to vaporize a tank, a bunker, or, as the sailors off the coast were learning, a destroyer. Kowalski looked back into the cockpit. He noticed a heavy iron ring sight bolted to the cowling, a simple aiming device. He imagined a young Japanese boy, maybe no older than the kid standing behind him, sitting in this metal bucket seat. He imagined the darkness of the mother plane's belly, the sudden blinding light of the drop, the roar of the rockets kicking in, and then that iron ring circling a US Navy ship. There was no way out. Once those rockets lit, you were part of the ballistics. Why do they call 'em Baka? The private asked, staring at the sleek, deadly shape. Means idiot, right? Kowalski ran his thumb over the riveted rim of the cockpit. Yeah, because the brass thinks it's stupid to throw a pilot away like a spent casing. They think it's desperate. He looked at the heavy latch on the canopy. But looking at this, Kowalski murmured, his voice echoing slightly in the damp cave. This isn't just desperation, kid. This is engineering. They built a machine where the only guidance chip available was a human brain. It ain't idiotic. It's precise. He stepped down from the skid, his boots squelching in the mud. The silence of the cave felt heavy, pressing in on them. Outside, the dull thump of artillery continued, the war grinding on toward the inevitable end. But in here, staring at the white rockets, waiting for pilots who would never arrive, the horror of the Pacific War came into sharp focus. It wasn't just about territory or resources anymore. It was a clash of psychologies. To the Americans, the Ohka was an abomination, a waste of life that justified the nickname idiot. To the creators, it was the cherry blossom, beautiful, fleeting, and destined to fall at the peak of its existence for the Emperor. Let's move out, he ordered, his voice rough. Rig 'em for demo. Blow the cave. I don't want anyone flying these things today. As the squad retreated toward the daylight, leaving the demolition charges ticking in the dark, the white missiles sat silent in the gloom waiting for a wind that would never blow again. In the end, the MXY-7 Ohka was a weapon of psychological terror that failed to deliver a strategic miracle. While the sinking of the USS Mannert L, Abele proved the terrifying potential of the concept. It was the only major warship sent to the bottom by a human-guided rocket. The flaw in the design wasn't the missile itself, it was the delivery system. The Mitsubishi Betty bombers required to carry them were slow, heavy, and filled with fuel. As Commander Jim Thach and the pilots of the US Navy quickly realized, the best defense against the Baka was to kill the mother before she could give birth. Of the 850 Ohkas produced, only 74 were ever used in combat. Most were destroyed on the ground, found rusting in caves like the one Sergeant Kowalski cleared, or shot down while still attached to their burning motherships. The weapon that was supposed to be the divine wind that saved Japan became instead a symbol of the tragic, desperate futility of the war's final months. To the Allied sailors, it was the idiot bomber, senseless waste of life. To the Japanese, it was the cherry blossom, a sacrifice of purity. But looking back through the lens of history, it stands as a grim reminder of what happens when a nation runs out of options but refuses to run out of resolve. What do you think about the Ohka project? Was it a marvel of desperate engineering or a tragic waste of young pilots? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Pacific War's strangest weapons, please hit that like button, it really helps the channel. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss our next flight into history. I'm your host, and thanks for watching.